Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. Today we're going to explore one of the most fascinating questions in all of human history. What if Christopher Columbus had never made it to the Americas? What if those three famous ships, the Santa Maria, the Niña, and the Pinta, had never left the Spanish harbor at all? It sounds like a simple question, but here's what's really happening when we dig into it. This single moment contains the power to reshape everything we know about our world. Picture this scene with me. It's August 3rd, 1492. The sun is just beginning to rise over the port of Palos de la Frontera, casting long shadows across wooden docks that creak and groan under the weight of cargo and ambition. The salt air carries the scent of adventure and the unknown. Christopher Columbus stands there, watching his three ships bob gently in the harbor, their masts reaching toward a sky that seems to promise endless possibilities. In our timeline, I-5, the one you and I live in, those ships sailed west into history. But imagine, just for a moment, that they didn't. Imagine that something went catastrophically wrong in those final hours before departure. Here's where it gets fascinating. There are so many ways this moment could have unfolded differently. Let's explore some of the possibilities that could have changed everything. Perhaps it was disease that stopped the voyage. Yellow fever was a constant threat in those days, and it moved through cramped quarters like wildfire. Picture this. The night before departure, as Columbus's crew sleeps fitfully in the ship's bellies, fever begins to spread. By morning, half the sailors are dead or dying, their bodies racked with the telltale symptoms that turn skin the color of old parchment. The surviving crew members, terrified and superstitious, refuse to sail. They see the fever as an omen, a clear sign that God himself opposes this journey into the unknown. Columbus pleads, threatens, offers double wages. Nothing works. The men scatter into the Spanish countryside, carrying stories of cursed ships and doomed voyages. Or maybe it was nature itself that intervened. The summer of 1492 was known for unusual weather patterns. Imagine a storm, not just any storm, but one of those once-in-a-century tempests that seems to channel the fury of the gods themselves. As Columbus makes his final preparations, the sky suddenly darkens. Lightning cracks the heavens with explosive force, and within minutes, the harbor becomes a cauldron of churning water and howling wind. The Santa Maria, caught unprepared, is smashed against the stone docks with such violence that her hull splits open like a broken egg. Simultaneously, lightning strikes both the Niña and the Pinta, setting their sails ablaze. Within hours, Columbus's entire fleet is reduced to charred timber and twisted metal, scattered across the harbor floor. But perhaps the most intriguing possibility is political. Queen Isabella, the woman who had finally agreed to fund Columbus's mad scheme, was known for her careful deliberation and occasional changes of heart. Picture her in the royal palace that night, unable to sleep, pacing the stone corridors as doubt gnaws at her mind. What if she had a prophetic dream? What if her advisors made one final compelling argument against the voyage? As dawn breaks, riders gallop through the Spanish countryside, their horses' hooves thundering against the packed earth roads. They carry sealed orders from the Queen herself. The voyage is cancelled, the funding revoked. Columbus is to return to court immediately. In any of these scenarios, Christopher Columbus never reaches the Americas. Instead, he becomes a footnote in history. Ti-Chen, another dreamer whose ambitions exceeded his grasp. He dies years later, perhaps in a Spanish tavern, ranting to anyone who will listen about the riches that await across the Western Sea. But nobody believes him. His maps gather dust. His theories about reaching Asia by sailing west are dismissed as the fantasies of a broken man. This is where our alternate timeline begins, at this single moment of failure that creates a crack in history. And here's what's truly remarkable. This crack doesn't remain small. Like a fracture in ice during a spring thaw, it spreads and widens until it becomes a chasm that separates two completely different worlds. When we look at this moment, we're not just examining a failed voyage, we're looking at the butterfly effect in its purest form. Every major event in our history, from the rise of European colonial empires to the founding of the United States, from the Industrial Revolution to the modern global economy, RAC, all of it traces back to those 3 ships leaving Spain on that August morning. Remove that departure, and everything changes. The immediate consequences might seem obvious. Without Columbus, there's no European discovery of the Americas. No conquistadors arrive to topple the Aztec and Inca empires. No smallpox epidemics devastate indigenous populations. No gold and silver flow from American mines to European treasuries. But these immediate changes are just the beginning. Here's what's actually happening when we remove Columbus from history. We're not just changing one event, we're fundamentally altering the trajectory of human civilization. The economic systems that would dominate the next 5 centuries never develop. The political structures that would define the modern world never form. The technological innovations, driven by colonial expansion and resource extraction, follow completely different paths. Think about it this way. Imagine our world as a vast river system, with countless streams and tributaries feeding into major waterways. Columbus's voyage was like damming the source of the mightiest river. Everything, downstream, changes course. Some streams that would have been mere tributaries become major rivers in their own right. Others that would have been mighty torrents dry up entirely. The entire landscape of human development takes on a completely different shape. This is the fascinating part. Without European colonization of the Americas, the civilizations already there continue along their own remarkable trajectories. The Aztec Empire, which in our timeline fell to a handful of Spanish conquistadors, aided by disease and superior weapons, instead continues its sophisticated development. These weren't primitive people living in huts, Aleva. They were master engineers, astronomers, and administrators who had built one of the most advanced urban centers in the world. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, already rivaled any European city in size and sophistication when the Spanish arrived in our timeline. Its system of floating gardens, called chinampas, was an agricultural innovation that supported a population density that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. Their calendar was more accurate than the one Europeans were using. Their surgical techniques were often superior to European medicine. In our alternate timeline, these innovations continue developing. Without the catastrophic interruption of Spanish conquest, Aztec engineers have centuries more to perfect their techniques. They solve the puzzle of the wheel, which they already understood but had used primarily for toys and religious objects, and begin applying it to transportation and industry. They develop metallurgy beyond the bronze and gold working they had already mastered. The same pattern repeats across the Americas. The Inca Empire, those incredible road builders and administrators who had created a communication system that could carry messages across thousands of miles of mountain terrain in just days, and continue expanding and refining their systems. Their understanding of architecture and engineering, they built structures so precisely fitted that you couldn't slide a knife blade between the stones, evolves in directions we can barely imagine. In North America, the Mississippian culture centered around Cahokia continues thriving instead of mysteriously declining before European contact. This was already a sophisticated urban civilization with complex trade networks stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. The mounds they built were massive earthwork projects that required coordinated labor and advanced planning. In our alternate timeline, these societies have centuries more to develop. But here's where the butterfly effect becomes truly mind-bending. These changes don't stay confined to the Americas. When European colonialism doesn't develop as it did in our timeline, the entire global balance of power shifts. Africa, which lost millions of people to the Atlantic slave trade, instead experiences continuous population growth and technological development. Asian empires, which in our timeline became dependent on American silver and were eventually dominated by European colonial powers, maintain their independence and continue developing along their own paths. The economic implications alone are staggering. Without American gold and silver flooding European markets, the price revolution that transformed European economics never happens. Different kingdoms rise to prominence, different technologies develop, different philosophies emerge to explain a world that never experienced the profound disruption of European colonialism. we can see how delicate the balance really was. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire succeeded largely because of timing, disease, and a handful of crucial advantages that might not have mattered just a few decades later. Hernán Cortés arrived at a moment when the Aztec Empire was dealing with internal conflicts and when Old World diseases had already begun weakening indigenous populations. A generation later, these advantages might not have existed. This is what makes our alternate timeline so compelling. It's not fantasy, it's the exploration of how easily history could have unfolded differently. Every civilization that European colonialism interrupted was on its own trajectory of development. Remove that interruption, and we get to see where those trajectories might have led. When we examine this moment, AIT-4, those ships that never sailed, we're looking at one of history's greatest pivot points. It's a reminder that the world we live in, with all its particular arrangements of power and culture and technology, was never inevitable. It emerged from a series of contingent events, any one of which could have gone differently. The timeline we're about to explore together shows us something profound about human potential. It reveals that innovation and sophistication aren't the special province of any particular culture or continent. Given time and opportunity, human societies everywhere develop remarkable solutions to the challenges they face. The story of European dominance isn't a story of inherent superiority. It's a story of timing, geography, and a crucial series of events that began with 3 ships leaving Spain on an August morning in 1492. As we continue this journey together, we'll see how removing that single voyage creates ripple effects that transform everything. Economics, politics, technology, and the very way humans organize themselves across the globe. We'll discover civilizations that reached heights we can barely imagine, technologies that developed along completely different paths, and a world that looks utterly alien to the one we know. The most remarkable thing about this alternate history? None of it requires magic or miracles. It simply requires recognizing that the path history actually took wasn't the only path it could have taken. Sometimes, the difference between the world that was and the world that might have been comes down to something as simple as 3 ships and the wind that carried them west. Those ships that never sailed carry us into a story about human possibility itself. Now that we've seen how those 3 ships never left Spain, let's explore what happens to Europe itself when the American treasure fleets never arrive. This is where our story gets really fascinating, because we're about to discover how profoundly American wealth shaped the Europe we think we know. Picture 16th century Spain in our timeline. Yeah, ships returning heavy with Aztec gold and Inca silver. Treasure fleets so laden with wealth that they needed military escorts to protect them from pirates. The Spanish crown became Europe's superpower almost overnight, funding armies that could march across continents and fleets that could dominate the seas. But in our alternate timeline, none of this happens. Without American wealth, Spain remains what it was before Columbus, SAD, a middle-tier kingdom still working out its identity after centuries of Moorish occupation. The Reconquista had ended just months before Columbus's planned voyage, and Spain was essentially a collection of recently unified kingdoms trying to figure out how to govern together. In our timeline, American gold solved that problem by making Spain so wealthy that internal politics became secondary to managing an empire. But without that wealth, Spain never transcends its regional squabbles. Here's what's actually happening. Spanish nobles continue fighting over land and influence just as they had for centuries. The crown, instead of funding global conquest, focuses on the more mundane business of taxation and local administration. Spanish armies, rather than marching across Europe, imposing Catholic orthodoxy, remain focused on defending the peninsula and perhaps expanding into North Africa, where the traditional enemies of Christian Spain still hold territory. This creates our first major butterfly effect in European politics. Without Spanish hegemony funded by American treasure, the balance of power that defined early modern Europe never emerges. Different kingdoms rise to fill the vacuum. Venice, that remarkable merchant republic, provides our most dramatic example. In our timeline, Spanish wealth and Portuguese trade routes gradually undermined Venetian dominance in the Mediterranean. American silver flooding European markets changed the entire basis of international trade, making Venice's carefully constructed commercial networks less relevant. But in our alternate timeline, Venice maintains its stranglehold on Mediterranean commerce for another 2 centuries. The Venetians were master traders and financial innovators who had essentially invented international banking. Their ships connected Europe to Asia through Constantinople and Alexandria, bringing spices, silks, and luxury goods that European nobles craved. Without American competition disrupting these trade routes, Venice experiences a renaissance that extends well into the 17th century. We can imagine Venetian innovations that never happened in our timeline. With continued prosperity and no external pressure to innovate militarily, Venetian engineers focus on perfecting their unique environment. They develop new techniques for managing water levels in their lagoon city. They create more sophisticated banking instruments that allow for even more complex international transactions. They become the financial capital of a Europe that never developed alternative power centers. But the most surprising beneficiary of this altered timeline might be the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In our timeline, this vast confederation stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea was gradually weakened by external pressures, many of them funded by Spanish gold. Swedish invasions, Russian expansion, and Ottoman campaigns all benefited directly or indirectly from the economic disruption that American wealth created across Europe. Without Spanish-funded enemies, the Commonwealth continues developing as Europe's dominant land power. This was already the largest country in Europe by area, with a unique political system that combined monarchical and democratic elements. The Commonwealth's parliament, the Sejm, was one of the most democratic institutions in 16th-century Europe. With continued stability, these democratic experiments might have evolved in fascinating directions. Picture Warsaw in 1650 in our alternate timeline, not the struggling capital of a beleaguered kingdom, but the thriving center of Europe's most powerful state. Polish nobles, secure in their borders and prosperous from Baltic grain trade, become patrons of arts and sciences. The Commonwealth's religious tolerance, remarkable for its time, attracts scholars and innovators from across Europe. What we see developing is not the fractured, war-torn Europe of our timeline, but a continent where different models of governance compete and evolve. The religious implications are equally dramatic. The Protestant Reformation still happens. The theological disputes that sparked it weren't dependent on American gold, but it unfolds very differently. Martin Luther's protests gain traction not against Spanish-funded Catholic armies, but against Italian merchant princes who have grown wealthy from Eastern trade. Here's what's really happening with the Reformation in our alternate timeline. Without Spanish military might enforcing Catholic orthodoxy, religious disputes become more intellectual and less military. The devastating religious wars that scarred Europe for generations in our timeline either don't happen or happen on a much smaller scale. Instead of armies funded by American treasure marching across Germany to impose religious conformity, we see religious competition through scholarship and persuasion. This creates space for religious innovations that were suppressed in our timeline. Perhaps new forms of Christianity emerge that blend Protestant and Catholic elements. Perhaps the Eastern Orthodox churches, freed from Ottoman pressure that was partly enabled by European religious conflicts, experience their own renaissance. The point is that religious development follows intellectual rather than military logic. England provides another fascinating case study. In our timeline, the arrival of potatoes from the Americas revolutionized European agriculture and enabled massive population growth. England's population roughly doubled between 1550 and 1650, largely because potato cultivation could feed far more people per acre than traditional grains. This population explosion fueled the growth of London into one of Europe's largest cities and provided the human resources for England's later imperial expansion. But in our alternate timeline, without American crops, England's population grows much more slowly. London never swells into a megacity that dominates English politics and economics. Instead, a dozen smaller cities share power, creating a completely different political structure. We can imagine an England where York, Bristol, Norwich, and other regional centres remain independent power bases. Instead of the highly centralised monarchy that emerged in our timeline, partly in response to the need to manage overseas colonies and trade, England develops a more federalised system. Regional parliaments might emerge, each representing different economic interests and local traditions. This decentralised England might actually be more democratic than the one we know. Without the pressure to compete globally that American colonies created, English political development focuses inward. The famous English Parliament evolves not as an institution to manage an empire, but as a way to coordinate between regional power centres. The technological implications ripple through everything. European innovation in our timeline was heavily driven by the needs of colonial administration and Feilerland, long-distance trade. Navigation instruments, shipbuilding techniques, military technologies, ISI, all of these advanced rapidly because European powers needed them to maintain their American empires. In our alternate timeline, European technology develops along completely different paths. Without the need to cross oceans or govern distant territories, European inventors focus on different problems. Perhaps they perfect land-based transportation earlier, developing sophisticated road networks and wheeled vehicles. Perhaps they advance manufacturing techniques to compete with Asian luxury goods rather than to outfit colonial expeditions. By 1700, the Europe of our alternate timeline looks completely alien to our eyes. Spain remains a regional power focused on Mediterranean concerns. Venice dominates eastern trade from its lagoon palaces. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth stretches across the continent as Europe's great democratic experiment. England develops as a confederation of regional centres rather than a unified imperial power. Most importantly, Europe never develops the colonial mindset that would define the next 3 centuries of our timeline. European kingdoms turn inward, perfecting arts and sciences within their borders, developing technologies for their own needs rather than for conquest. Without the enormous profits of colonial extraction driving European development, innovation follows different paths entirely. The absence of colonial competition creates space for different kinds of cultural flowering. Italian city-states, freed from Spanish domination, experience a second renaissance. German principalities, not devastated by religious wars funded by foreign gold, become centres of learning and craftsmanship. Scandinavian kingdoms develop their own unique approaches to governance and technology. Perhaps most intriguingly, this inward-focused Europe might actually advance faster in certain areas than the Europe of our timeline. Colonial wealth in our timeline often made European elites lazy and conservative. Why innovate when you can simply extract wealth from distant territories? Without that option, European societies are forced to become more productive and creative with their own resources. We can imagine scientific advances that never happened in our timeline because European scholars weren't distracted by the practicalities of colonial management. Universities in Prague or Krakow might become centres of astronomical observation. Workshops in Venice or Augsburg might perfect manufacturing techniques that won't emerge in our timeline for centuries. The social implications are equally profound. European society in our timeline was profoundly shaped by colonial wealth and the slave trade. Enormous fortunes built on plantation, agriculture, and human trafficking created new forms of inequality and new justifications for racial hierarchy. None of this happens in our alternate timeline. Instead, European social development follows patterns more similar to what we see in Asian societies, AVDIT, gradual evolution of existing structures rather than revolutionary transformation driven by external wealth. Class systems remain, but they're based on traditional land ownership and craft specialization rather than colonial extraction. This Europe, turned inward, focused on internal development, freed from the corrupting influence of colonial wealth, Yetio, represents a completely different path for Western civilization. It's not necessarily better or worse than the Europe we know, but it's profoundly different. The aggressive expansionism, the racial hierarchies, the global reach that characterized European power in our timeline simply never develop. By the time this alternate Europe finally encounters the Americas, DIN, and we'll see how that happens in our timeline, they meet as equals rather than as conquerors and conquered. The technological gaps that enabled European domination in our timeline never open because European development followed different priorities. This is the Europe that sets the stage for our next chapter. a continent that never learned to think of itself as destined to rule the world, facing civilizations that had centuries more to develop their own remarkable potential. While Europe develops along its altered path, the Americas write their own extraordinary story. This is where our alternate timeline becomes truly remarkable, because we get to see what American civilizations accomplished when they had centuries more to develop without the catastrophic interruption of European conquest. Let's start with the Aztec Empire, which in our timeline fell to Hernán Cortés and his 500 conquistadors, aided by smallpox and superior weapons. But here's what's really happening in our alternate timeline. The Aztec Empire, which was already one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth, continues its remarkable trajectory of development. By 1550, just 58 years after Columbus never sailed, Aztec engineers have achieved something that seems almost impossible to us. They've moved beyond using wheels just for toys and religious ceremonies. In our timeline, the Aztecs understood the wheel perfectly well, but they used it primarily for small decorative objects and children's toys. Scholars have long debated why they never applied it to transportation, but the most likely explanation is that they simply didn't need it for their immediate purposes. The Aztec Empire was built around waterways and human carriers. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was connected by canals, and their porter system could carry goods efficiently across even mountainous terrain. But in our alternate timeline, with centuries more to develop, and no external pressure stopping their innovation, Aztec engineers begin experimenting with larger wheeled vehicles. Picture this transformation. Aztec workshops in Tenochtitlan, where master craftsmen, working with the same precision they brought to their elaborate featherwork and gold jewelry, begin creating the first wheeled carts in American history. These aren't crude wagons. They're sophisticated vehicles that reflect centuries of Aztec engineering knowledge. They incorporate the same mathematical precision that went into Aztec architecture and calendar systems. The results revolutionized trade across their empire. The Aztec trade network, which already stretched from central Mexico to Central America, becomes even more efficient. Goods that once required human porters can now move more quickly and in larger quantities. This economic boom funds further innovation and expansion. But the Aztecs aren't the only American civilization reaching new heights. The Inca Empire, those incredible master road builders and administrators who created surgical techniques we still admire today, pushed their highway system beyond anything even they had imagined. The Inca road network in our timeline was already one of humanity's greatest engineering achievements. Over 25,000 miles of roads threading through some of the world's most challenging terrain. In our alternate timeline, Inca engineers don't stop there. By 1600, their highway system extends far beyond the traditional boundaries of their empire. Inca roads push north through what we would call Colombia and Venezuela, creating the first truly continental transportation network in the Americas. They push south through Chile and Argentina, reaching almost to the southern tip of the continent. Here's what's actually happening with Inca expansion. They're not just building roads, they're creating the infrastructure for a continental civilization. Every 20 miles or so along these highways, they build tambos, way stations that provide food, shelter, and fresh supplies for travelers. But in our extended timeline, these tambos evolve into much more than simple rest stops. They become regional administrative centers, trading posts, and centers of learning. The Inca administrative system, which was already remarkably sophisticated, grows to match their expanded infrastructure. They perfect their quipu system, IMI, those knotted string devices they used for record-keeping, into something approaching a written language. Inca administrators can now manage economic and population data across a territory that spans most of South America. But the real surprise in our alternate timeline comes from North America, where developments unfold that would astonish any European visitor, TT-17, if Europeans ever came to see them. The Mississippian culture, centered around the great city of Cahokia, continues building instead of mysteriously declining as it did in our timeline. Cahokia in our timeline was already remarkable, a city of perhaps 20,000 people located near present-day Street Louis, with massive earthen mounds that rivaled the pyramids in scope and planning. The largest mound, Monk's Mound, was larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. But in our alternate timeline, without the mysterious collapse that ended Mississippian civilization, Cahokia keeps growing. By 1600, Cahokia has become a city of 200,000 inhabitants, making it the largest city in the Americas and larger than any European city except perhaps Constantinople. The engineering required to support such a population in a pre-industrial society is staggering. Cahokian architects develop sophisticated water management systems, agricultural techniques that can feed enormous populations, and construction methods that allow them to build ever more impressive ceremonial and administrative structures. The social organization required for such a city pushes Mississippian civilization toward innovations we can barely imagine. Trade networks stretch from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains. Cahokian merchants deal in copper from Lake Superior, shells from the Caribbean, obsidian from the Western Mountains, and countless other specialized goods. But perhaps the most significant development in North America comes from the Iroquois Confederacy. In our timeline, the Iroquois created one of the world's most sophisticated democratic systems, AIFI, a confederation of 6 nations united under the Great Law of Peace. This system was so advanced that it would later influence the framers of the American Constitution. In our alternate timeline, with centuries more to develop, the Iroquois Confederacy expands its influence across vast territories. The Iroquois model of confederation proves so successful that neighboring peoples adopt similar systems. By 1700, a great confederation stretches from the Atlantic coast to the Great Lakes, uniting dozens of different peoples under a democratic system that makes decisions through consensus and representation. This isn't a conquest empire like those we see in the Old World, Re-Fe 5 AC. It's a voluntary association of peoples who maintain their own cultures while cooperating for mutual benefit. Here's what's fascinating about this North American confederation. It develops political innovations that won't appear in Europe for centuries. The Iroquois principle that leaders should consider the impact of their decisions on 7 generations in the future becomes a cornerstone of continental governance. Environmental protection isn't an afterthought, re-changes. It's built into the political system itself. The economic implications of these developments reshape the entire continent. By 1700, the Americas host not scattered tribes but continental empires with sophisticated urban centers, continent-spanning trade networks, and populations that rival anything in the Old World. The Aztec Empire, with its improved transportation networks, develops manufacturing capabilities that would impress European visitors. Aztec workshops produce textiles, metalwork, and luxury goods using techniques perfected over centuries. Their astronomical knowledge, already advanced enough to create calendars more accurate than European ones, leads to navigation techniques that eventually enable oceanic travel. The Inca Empire, with its continental road network, becomes a model of efficient administration that manages resources across climate zones from tropical rainforest to high mountain desert. Inca agricultural techniques, including their innovative terracing systems, support populations much larger than the land could sustain using European methods. In North America, the Confederation system creates unprecedented cooperation between different peoples. The great trading centers, like Cahokia, become cosmopolitan cities where dozens of languages are spoken and countless different cultural traditions meet and blend. This cultural exchange accelerates innovation in ways that isolated European kingdoms never experience. Perhaps most remarkably, these American civilizations develop technologies along completely different paths from Old World societies. Without pack animals like horses or oxen, American engineers become masters of human-powered transportation and construction. Without iron tools, they perfect techniques using bronze, copper, and obsidian that achieve results European technology can't match. Aztec obsidian blades, for example, can be made sharper than modern surgical steel. Inca bronze alloys are superior to many European metals. Mississippian earthwork construction techniques move enormous amounts of material with precision that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the development of modern earth-moving equipment. The agricultural innovations alone would transform any old-world society lucky enough to learn them. American crops like corn, potatoes, and tomatoes eventually revolutionized old-world agriculture. But in our timeline, American farmers had centuries more to perfect these crops and develop new ones. Aztec chinampas, ITM, those floating gardens that Copaya could produce multiple crops per year, evolve into even more sophisticated systems. Inca terrace, agriculture expands to create some of the most productive farmland in the world. By 1700, when our timeline finally brings old and new worlds together, American cities would make European visitors gasp in amazement. Tenochtitlan, rebuilt and expanded multiple times, rivals Venice in its water-based architecture, while exceeding it in size and sophistication. Cusco, the Inca capital, anchors a road network that makes Roman engineering look primitive by comparison. Cahokia demonstrates urban planning and environmental integration that won't appear in European cities for centuries. But here's the most important point. These aren't just bigger versions of the civilizations Europeans encountered in our timeline. These are societies that had centuries more to solve fundamental problems of governance, technology, and social organization. They've developed solutions to challenges that European civilizations are still struggling with. The Aztec Empire has solved the problem of urban water management in ways that European cities won't master until the modern era. The Inca Empire has created administrative systems that can govern diverse populations across vast distances without the oppression that characterizes European empires. The North American confederations have developed democratic systems that actually represent their people's interests rather than just elite preferences. When Europeans finally encounter these civilizations in our alternate timeline, they're not meeting primitive peoples ripe for conquest. They're meeting sophisticated societies that have spent centuries perfecting different approaches to the fundamental challenges of human civilization. The meeting will be between equals, and that changes everything about how our story unfolds from here. These American empires rising represent human potential unleashed. What happens when sophisticated civilizations have time and space to develop according to their own logic, rather than being interrupted by external conquest? It's a reminder that the primitive societies European colonialism encountered were actually advanced civilizations caught at a moment of vulnerability, not peoples incapable of sophisticated development. The stage is now set for our next chapter, where we'll see how the butterfly effect of those ships that never sailed spreads to transform the entire globe. Now we need to step back and see the bigger picture, because the changes we've been exploring don't stay confined to Europe and the Americas. Remove Columbus's voyage and watch how those changes ripple across the entire globe like a stone dropped in still water. The butterfly effect spreads to every continent, transforming civilizations that seem completely unconnected to 3 Spanish ships that never sailed. Let's start with Africa, because this is where some of the most profound changes occur. In our timeline, the Atlantic slave trade transported roughly 12 million Africans to the Americas over the course of 4 centuries. But these numbers tell only part of the story. For every person who survived the Middle Passage, historians estimate that 2 or 3 more died in the wars, raids, and forced marches that fed the slave trade. We're talking about a demographic catastrophe that drained Africa of perhaps 30 to 40 million people during its most productive years. Here's what's actually happening when we remove this catastrophe from African history. Those 12 million people remain home, along with all their descendants. By 1800, Africa's population is perhaps 50 to 60 million people larger than in our timeline. But the implications go far beyond simple numbers. The Kingdom of Congo provides our most dramatic example. In our timeline, Portuguese slave traders and their African collaborators systematically destroyed Congolese society through constant warfare and population raids. The kingdom, which had been one of Africa's most sophisticated states, essentially collapsed under the pressure of the slave trade. But in our alternate timeline, the Kingdom of Congo not only survives but thrives. Picture Central Africa in 1750 in our alternate timeline. The Kingdom of Congo has evolved into a regional powerhouse that stretches from the Atlantic coast deep into the continent's interior. Congolese cities grow larger and more sophisticated, supported by populations that in our timeline were lost to slavery. The kingdom's bronze-working techniques, already advanced when Portuguese traders first arrived, combine with iron knowledge acquired from northern neighbors to create metallurgical capabilities that rival anything in Europe. This is where things get truly fascinating. African technological development follows its own unique path. Without the disruption of the slave trade, African societies have centuries more to build on their existing innovations. The iron-working techniques that made African weapons and tools superior to European ones in many early encounters continue advancing. African agricultural methods, perfectly adapted to local conditions, support larger populations and more complex societies. By 1750, we can imagine an African industrial revolution, beginning around the great cities of the Sudan and the gold-producing regions of West Africa. African engineers, working with metals they've been perfecting for millennia, develop steam power along different principles from European innovations. Perhaps they perfect charcoal-based techniques that are more efficient than the coal-based systems developing in Europe. Perhaps they create mechanical principles based on their sophisticated understanding of water management and irrigation. The ripple effects spread far beyond Central and West Africa. East African trading cities like Kilwa and Mogadishu, freed from disruption that Portuguese interference caused in our timeline, continue developing as sophisticated commercial centers. The Swahili coast becomes even more integrated with the Indian Ocean trading system, creating cultural and technological exchanges that accelerate innovation across the region. In Asia, the transformation is equally dramatic but follows different patterns. The story begins with American silver, which in our timeline flooded Chinese markets and fundamentally altered the Ming dynasty's economy. Chinese merchants became dependent on this foreign currency for international trade, making China vulnerable to external economic pressures that would eventually contribute to the dynasty's downfall. But in our alternate timeline, without American silver flooding global markets, the Ming dynasty's economy develops along completely different lines. Here's what's really happening. China never becomes dependent on foreign currency for its economic stability. The Chinese maintain their traditional economic systems while gradually innovating from within. This economic independence means that when European traders eventually arrive in our timeline, China negotiates from strength rather than need. The implications are staggering. Chinese technological development, which in our timeline was often focused on adapting to external pressures and foreign trade demands, instead follows internal logic. Chinese engineers perfect printing techniques that won't appear in Europe for centuries. Chinese astronomers, freed from the need to accommodate foreign influences, make discoveries that reshape understanding of the cosmos. Perhaps most importantly, Chinese political development proceeds without the external pressures that contributed to dynastic collapse in our timeline. The Ming dynasty, or perhaps a successor dynasty that emerges through normal political evolution rather than crisis, continues governing the world's largest and most sophisticated state. This creates a completely different balance of power when East finally meets West. Japan provides another fascinating case study. In our timeline, Portuguese firearms introduced around 1550 completely transformed samurai warfare and accelerated Japan's political unification under the Tokugawa shogunate. But in our alternate timeline, without Portuguese traders bringing guns to Japan, samurai warfare develops along completely different paths. Japanese warriors, those masters of sword fighting who elevated combat to an art form, have centuries more to perfect their techniques without the disruption of gunpowder weapons. We can imagine military innovations that seem almost fantastical to us. Perhaps sword-fighting techniques so advanced that a single warrior becomes devastatingly effective against multiple opponents. Perhaps defensive technologies that make traditional Japanese castles truly impregnable without artillery. But the social implications are even more profound. The Tokugawa shogunate's rigid social order was partly a response to the military revolution that firearms created. Without that disruption, Japanese society might evolve toward greater social mobility and political participation. The remarkable urban culture that flourished in cities like Edo and Osaka in our timeline, might develop even more sophisticated forms of art, literature, and commerce. The changes ripple even to Australia, that continent which remained isolated from Old World developments until European colonization in our timeline. Without British colonization, driven by American independence and the need for new penal colonies, Aboriginal Australians continue developing their remarkable sustainable civilization for centuries more. This is perhaps the most mind-bending transformation of all, because it shows us a completely different model of human development. Aboriginal Australian society, which had already achieved sustainable resource management across an entire continent, continues, perfecting these techniques for millennia more than in our timeline. They develop sophisticated astronomical knowledge, complex trade networks that span thousands of miles, and social systems that maintain stability while adapting to changing conditions. We can imagine Aboriginal innovations that seem almost magical to societies based on European models. Perhaps fire management techniques so sophisticated that they can engineer entire ecosystems. Perhaps navigation methods so precise that they can cross vast distances of seemingly empty desert with perfect accuracy. Perhaps social technologies that prevent conflict while allowing for complex cooperation across dozens of different language groups. The Indian Ocean becomes a completely different space in our alternate timeline. Without European colonial powers disrupting traditional trading patterns, the ocean remains what it had been for centuries, a highway connecting sophisticated civilizations from East Africa to Southeast Asia to China. Indian Ocean cities grow larger and more cosmopolitan. Cultural exchange accelerates innovation in ways that isolated European development never achieves. Indian mathematics and astronomy, already the world's most advanced in many areas, continue developing without external disruption. Indian metallurgy and textile production maintain their global dominance. The Mughal Empire, or whatever political system emerges in the Indian subcontinent, develops without the pressures that European colonialism would eventually create. Southeast Asian trading cities like Malacca become even more important as commercial and cultural centers. The spice trade that originally motivated European exploration of alternative routes to Asia continues flowing through traditional channels, enriching the societies that control these trade routes rather than diverting that wealth to European colonial powers. Perhaps most intriguingly, the absence of European colonial disruption allows for political experiments that never had the chance to develop in our timeline. We might see new forms of international cooperation emerging from the Indian Ocean trading networks, perhaps confederations of trading cities that create the world's first truly international democratic institutions, perhaps new religions or philosophical systems that emerge from the cultural mixing that occurs in these cosmopolitan centers. The Pacific Ocean tells a similar story. Polynesian navigators, those remarkable seafarers who had already colonized islands across thousands of miles of open ocean using only traditional techniques, continue their explorations. Without European diseases decimating Pacific populations, Polynesian societies grow larger and more complex. Hawaiian and Tahitian kingdoms might develop into sophisticated regional powers. New Zealand's Maori society continues evolving its unique approaches to resource management and social organization. By the time our alternate timeline reaches the point where old and new worlds finally meet, the entire globe looks fundamentally different from the world we know. Africa hosts thriving kingdoms and emerging industrial centers. Asia maintains its position as the world's most advanced region while developing along its own trajectories. Australia demonstrates alternative models of sustainable civilization. The Pacific Ocean connects sophisticated island societies rather than European colonial outposts. Here's what's most remarkable about all these changes. None of them require any society to be fundamentally different from what it actually was. African kingdoms don't need to be more sophisticated than they were. They just need to develop without the catastrophic disruption of the slave trade. Chinese civilization doesn't need to be more advanced than it was. It just needs to evolve without the pressures that European colonialism created. Aboriginal Australian society doesn't need to be different from what it was. It just needs more time to perfect its already remarkable adaptations. The butterfly effect that began with 3 ships that never sailed has now touched every inhabited continent. It's created a world where human development followed dozens of different paths, instead of being forced into the single channel that European colonialism created. It's a world where the remarkable diversity of human approaches to civilization had time and space to flourish. This global transformation sets the stage for the most dramatic moment in our alternate timeline, when these fully developed, sophisticated civilizations finally encounter each other. The meeting of worlds that's coming will be unlike anything that happened in our timeline, because it will be a meeting of equals rather than a confrontation between conquerors and conquered. The stage is set for contact, but contact between civilizations that have had centuries more to develop their full potential. The meeting of hemispheres was always inevitable, but timing changes everything. In our alternate timeline, first contact doesn't happen through European exploration westward, but through American exploration eastward. And when it finally occurs, it transforms both worlds in ways no one could have predicted. The date is September 15th, 1812. Picture the scene. A thick morning fog clings to the Portuguese coast near Lisbon. Local fishermen, heading out for their daily catch, suddenly see shapes emerging from the mist that seem impossible. Ships, but unlike any ships they've ever imagined, appear from the grey ocean like something from a dream or nightmare. These vessels are massive, larger than the biggest European warships, but they move with a grace that seems almost supernatural. Their hulls are decorated with elaborate artwork that catches the morning light, feathers and gold inlay that create patterns more complex than anything European artisans have achieved. The sails, if they can be called sails, seem to catch the wind in ways that defy European understanding of seamanship. The fishermen flee in terror, their small boats racing back toward shore as they spread news that will soon reach every court in Europe. The impossible has happened. Ships from beyond the known world have arrived. Here's what's actually happening. This is a joint Iroquois-Aztec naval expedition, the culmination of centuries of American technological development. The fleet consists of 60 ships carrying 3,000 warriors, traders, scholars, and diplomats. These aren't crude vessels hastily assembled for exploration, one say 5. They're the product of sophisticated naval architecture that had centuries to evolve. The technology behind these ships would amaze any European observer. The Aztecs, building on their mastery of mathematics and astronomy, had perfected navigation techniques that European sailors couldn't match. They could calculate position and direction using star charts more accurate than anything European astronomers had created. Their understanding of ocean currents and wind patterns came from generations of coastal navigation that gradually expanded into open ocean travel. The Iroquois contributed their own innovations, shipbuilding techniques that created vessels both strong and flexible enough to handle the worst ocean storms. Drawing on their deep knowledge of woodworking and their understanding of natural materials, Iroquois shipwrights had created hulls that could flex with waves rather than fighting them. The result was ships that could travel farther and survive rougher conditions than European vessels. But perhaps the most remarkable innovation was the method of propulsion. These ships didn't rely solely on wind power like European vessels. American engineers had developed a hybrid system that combined sails with human-powered mechanisms based on the sophisticated understanding of leverage and mechanical advantage that went into their massive construction projects. The result was ships that could maintain speed even in calm conditions and could maneuver with precision that would astonish European naval commanders. The expedition itself represents the culmination of a remarkable diplomatic achievement. The Iroquois Confederacy and the Aztec Empire, separated by thousands of miles, had managed to create an alliance that pooled their greatest technological achievements. Iroquois diplomats, traveling the continental trade networks that connected North and South America, had spent decades negotiating this partnership. The motivation for the voyage came from accumulated evidence that land existed beyond the Eastern Ocean. American astronomers, with their sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics, had calculated that the Earth was round and had estimated its size with remarkable accuracy. They knew that sailing east would eventually reach land, and their calculations suggested that the distance was manageable with the right technology and preparation. The expedition had been planned for decades. American scholars had studied wind patterns and ocean currents. American shipbuilders had perfected vessels capable of oceanic travel. American diplomats had created the international cooperation necessary to fund and organize such a massive undertaking. When the fleet finally sailed, it represented the finest achievements of 3 centuries of American technological and political development. First contact comes at Lisbon, but it's unlike anything that happened in our timeline. The Aztec ambassador, speaking through a Maya interpreter who had learned Latin from fragments of European texts that had somehow drifted across the Atlantic over the centuries, delivers a message that shocks European courts. We come from the sunset lands, bringing friendship and trade to the sunrise people. The Europeans initially assume they're facing some kind of elaborate hoax or supernatural visitation. The ships are too advanced, the crew too numerous, the whole situation too impossible for European minds conditioned to think of themselves as the world's most sophisticated civilization. Portuguese officials send urgent messages to other European courts, seeking guidance on how to respond to this unprecedented situation. But here's where our alternate timeline takes its most dramatic turn. When Old World and New World diseases finally meet after 3 centuries of separation, the exchange isn't as catastrophically one-sided as it was in our timeline. Europeans face American diseases they have no immunity to, while Americans suffer from Old World plagues that are new to them. The biological playing field is leveled by mutual devastation. The disease exchange that follows first contact kills millions on both sides of the Atlantic. European cities, already crowded and unsanitary by modern standards, prove vulnerable to American diseases that evolved in completely different environments. American expeditionaries, despite their superior ships and technology, suffer devastating losses from European diseases they'd never encountered. This mutual catastrophe forces both sides to cooperate in ways that never happened in our timeline. Neither side can afford to exploit the other's weakness, because both sides are equally weakened. The result is the world's first truly equal meeting between Old World and New World civilizations. European physicians, working alongside American healers who have their own sophisticated understanding of medicine and disease, begin developing treatments that neither side could have created alone. American knowledge of botanical medicine combines with European understanding of anatomy and physiology. The medical cooperation that emerges from this crisis becomes the foundation for broader cultural and technological exchange. The diplomatic implications are equally profound. European kings and queens, accustomed to thinking of themselves as the pinnacle of human civilization, suddenly face ambassadors from empires they didn't know existed, empires that are clearly their equals in sophistication and superior in some technologies. The shock forces a fundamental reassessment of European assumptions about their place in the world. The Aztec Empire's mathematical and astronomical knowledge amazes European scholars. Aztec calendars are more accurate than European ones. Aztec engineering techniques achieve results that European architects thought impossible. When Aztec engineers examine European cathedrals, they point out structural weaknesses and suggest improvements that European builders had never considered. The Iroquois Confederacy's democratic institutions prove equally shocking to European political thinkers. Here's a governmental system that actually represents its people's interests, that makes decisions through consensus rather than royal decree, that considers the long-term consequences of political choices in ways European monarchies never attempted. European political philosophers, many of whom had been developing theories about representative government, suddenly have working examples to study. But the technological exchange proves most transformative of all. American metallurgy, based on centuries of perfecting bronze and copper alloys, offers techniques that European smiths immediately recognize as superior for many applications. American agricultural methods, developed over millennia to work with specific soil and climate conditions, provide solutions to European farming problems that had seemed unsolvable. European innovations prove equally valuable to American visitors. European printing techniques, combined with American mathematical knowledge, lead to rapid advances in both regions. European glassmaking, refined over centuries of cathedral construction, opens new possibilities for American astronomers who had already achieved remarkable precision with naked-eye observation. The cultural exchange accelerates beyond anything either side had anticipated. American scholars, accustomed to learning through oral tradition and pictographic writing, discover the advantages of European alphabetic systems for certain kinds of record-keeping. European artists, seeing American featherwork and textile techniques, begin incorporating these methods into their own traditions. Perhaps most importantly, both sides discover that human creativity and intelligence aren't the special province of any particular culture or continent. European assumptions about their own superiority crumble when faced with American achievements in astronomy, engineering, and governance. American visitors realize that the Sunrise People have developed remarkable innovations in areas where American civilizations had focused less attention. The initial exchange lasts 3 years. The American expedition, reduced by disease but enriched by knowledge, finally returns home in 1815, carrying European visitors, who will become the first Old World ambassadors to the Americas. These European envoys, Tabi, scholars, craftsmen, and diplomats carefully selected for their ability to appreciate and learn from unfamiliar cultures, will witness civilizations that challenge everything they thought they knew about human potential. When they reach Tenochtitlan, rebuilt and expanded multiple times since the Aztec Empire's golden age, European visitors find a city larger and more sophisticated than any in Europe. The floating gardens that feed the population represent agricultural innovations centuries ahead of European techniques. The astronomical observatory that crowns the great temple complex houses instruments more precise than anything in European universities. The journey north to Iroquois territory proves equally revelatory. European diplomats, accustomed to the rigid hierarchies of monarchical government, witness democratic institutions that actually function. They see how the Iroquois Confederacy makes decisions that consider environmental and social consequences generations into the future. They observe a political system where leaders are chosen for their wisdom and judgment rather than their birth or wealth. The return journey to Europe in 1818 carries the first American ambassadors to European courts. These delegations, combining Aztec scholars, Iroquois diplomats, and Maya interpreters, arrive in a Europe that has spent 6 years preparing for their visit. European governments, stunned by the reports of their own envoys, have begun reassessing everything from military strategy to agricultural policy. The reception in European capitals proves awkward in ways that reveal deep cultural differences. European courts, built around ceremony and hierarchy, struggle to accommodate visitors from societies organized around completely different principles. Aztec nobles, accustomed to authority based on achievement and religious knowledge, find European royal ceremony both impressive and baffling. Iroquois leaders, representing democratic confederations, diplomatic with monarchs who rule by divine right, but the intellectual exchange proves immediately fruitful. American mathematical knowledge, particularly Aztec astronomical calculations, revolutionizes European understanding of celestial mechanics. European universities, previously convinced of their own superiority in natural philosophy, suddenly realize they've been working with incomplete knowledge for centuries. The technological collaboration that emerges transforms both worlds. European clockmaking techniques, combined with American mathematical precision, lead to timekeeping devices more accurate than either civilization had achieved alone. American botanical knowledge, combined with European medical theory, produces pharmaceutical advances that save lives on both sides of the Atlantic. The agricultural exchange proves most revolutionary of all. European visitors to the Americas discover crop varieties and farming, techniques that could transform Old World agriculture. American visitors to Europe find livestock and tools that could revolutionize New World farming. The biological exchange that follows, carefully managed this time to prevent the disease catastrophes of first contact, gradually transforms both hemispheres. By 1820, regular trade routes connect the Americas to Europe. But these aren't the colonial relationships that characterized our timeline. These are exchanges between equals, partnerships between civilizations that recognize each other's achievements and contributions. American gold and silver flow to Europe, but as payment for European goods and knowledge rather than as tribute extracted by conquest. European manufactured goods flow to the Americas, but as trade items rather than symbols of technological superiority. American agricultural products transform European diets, while European livestock and tools improve American farming. The economic relationships that develop benefit both sides, rather than enriching one at the expense of the other. The political implications ripple through both worlds. European monarchs, confronted with working examples of democratic government, face questions from their own subjects about why political power shouldn't be more widely distributed. American confederations, seeing European technological achievements, begin adopting innovations that increase their own capabilities without compromising their democratic principles. Most importantly, both civilizations realize that the world is larger and more complex than either had imagined. The meeting of worlds that began with ships emerging from morning fog becomes an ongoing dialogue between different approaches to the fundamental challenges of human civilization. Neither side has all the answers, but together they begin developing solutions that neither could have achieved alone. This equal meeting of civilizations sets the stage for our next chapter, where we'll see how technology develops when human creativity is freed from the constraints of colonial exploitation and cultural supremacy. In our alternate timeline, the Industrial Revolution doesn't begin in British coal mines or Manchester textile factories. Instead, it emerges from an entirely unexpected source, the high mountain workshops of the Inca Empire. This is where our story takes one of its most fascinating turns, because when innovation follows need rather than exploitation, technology develops along paths we can barely imagine. Picture Cusco in 1800, not the conquered city of Spanish colonial rule, but the thriving capital of a continental empire that has had centuries to perfect its remarkable engineering traditions. Inca workshops, nestled in the Andes at altitudes that would challenge modern visitors, have become centers of mechanical innovation that rival anything in the Old World. Here's what's actually happening in these mountain laboratories. Inca engineers, those masters of precision stonework who could fit massive blocks together without mortar, have applied their understanding of mechanical principles to create the world's first mechanical calculators. But these aren't devices based on European gear systems. These are entirely different. The Inca approach to mechanical calculation grows directly from their traditional technologies. Remember, these were the people who developed the Quipu system, CHA, those knotted strings that could encode complex mathematical and administrative information with remarkable precision. Inca mathematicians had been working with sophisticated numerical concepts for centuries before Europeans arrived in our timeline. In our alternate timeline, with centuries more to develop, Inca engineers create calculating machines that use precisely balanced stones and controlled water flow rather than metal gears and springs. Picture devices that look more like miniature architectural models than mechanical instruments. Stone frameworks, where water channels guide calculations through physical processes that mirror mathematical operations. These stone calculators can perform computations that would challenge European mathematicians. Inca engineers use them to design their continental road networks, to calculate astronomical positions for their improved calendar systems, and to manage the economic data for an empire that stretches across most of South America. The precision required to create such devices pushes Inca stoneworking techniques to levels that seem almost supernatural to European observers. But the Inca aren't the only American civilization pushing technological boundaries in unexpected directions. Meanwhile, in the rebuilt and expanded Tenochtitlan, Aztec scientists have achieved something that will revolutionize human understanding of the cosmos. They've perfected optics centuries before European developments in this field. The Aztec achievement grows from their already advanced astronomical knowledge. In our timeline, Aztec astronomers had created calendars more accurate than European ones, and had mapped celestial movements with remarkable precision using only naked eye observation. In our alternate timeline, with centuries more to develop their techniques, they begin experimenting with ways to enhance human vision for astronomical purposes. Aztec opticians, working with their traditional materials but applying mathematical principles perfected over generations, create the first telescopes in human history. But these aren't crude devices. They're precision instruments that reflect centuries of Aztec mathematical and artistic sophistication. The lenses are ground using techniques derived from Aztec jewelry making, achieving clarity that European craftsmen won't match for decades. By 1750, Aztec astronomers using these telescopes make a discovery that shocks the scientific world. They observe and document Saturn's rings, becoming the first humans to see this remarkable feature of our solar system. The discovery sparks a scientific revolution centered in Tenochtitlan rather than European capitals. Aztec scholars, building on this success, begin systematic observation of the night sky that reveals details no human had ever seen before. The scientific implications ripple far beyond astronomy. Aztec opticians, having mastered the creation of telescopes, begin developing microscopes that reveal the hidden world of very small objects. Aztec physicians, using these new instruments, make discoveries about disease and human anatomy that advance medical knowledge by centuries. But perhaps the most surprising technological breakthrough comes from an entirely unexpected source: the Pacific Northwest coast of North America. Here, among the peoples who had been harvesting the sea's abundance for millennia, engineering innovation takes a direction that no old-world civilization had ever imagined. Coastal peoples, needing better ways to access the ocean's resources, develop something that seems almost fantastic. Functional submarine vessels. The technology builds on centuries of experience with waterproof construction, using materials and techniques perfected for their unique environment. The submarines of our alternate timeline aren't crude diving bells. They're sophisticated underwater craft sealed with perfected rubber techniques that had been traded up the Pacific coast from Amazonian peoples for generations. These vessels can dive to depths that surface ships can't reach and can travel underwater for distances that open entirely new possibilities for ocean exploration and resource extraction. By 1820, Pacific Northwest submariners have mapped underwater territories that remain unknown to surface vessels. They've discovered underwater forests of kelp that could provide new resources. They've found underwater caves and geological formations that reveal secrets about the Earth's structure. Most importantly, they've proven that the ocean's depths can be explored and exploited using human technology. The implications transform maritime culture across the Americas. News of underwater travel spreads through the continental trade networks, inspiring innovations in other regions. Aztec engineers begin experimenting with underwater exploration of their lake systems. Inca engineers consider whether underwater techniques could improve their understanding of mountain water sources. Meanwhile, in the Old World, parallel developments proceed along different paths. European engineering, freed from the pressures of colonial exploitation that drove innovation in our timeline, focuses on solving problems within European societies, rather than on developing technologies for distant conquest and extraction. European innovations during this period reflect different priorities entirely. Without the need to transport wealth from distant colonies or to maintain control over unwilling populations, European inventors focus on improving life within their own borders. They perfect agricultural techniques that increase food production. They develop manufacturing methods that create better goods for European consumers. They advance medical knowledge that improves European health and longevity. The crucial moment comes around 1850, when steam power finally emerges, not in one place, but simultaneously in 3 different regions, using 3 different approaches. This parallel development proves that human innovation, when freed from the constraints of colonial competition, follows multiple paths toward similar goals. In Europe, steam development builds on centuries of metallurgy and coal extraction. European engineers create steam engines that are powerful and efficient, well suited to the coal resources and manufacturing needs of European societies. In the Inca Empire, steam power develops from their sophisticated understanding of water management and high-altitude engineering. Inca steam engines use different principles, perhaps more efficient use of wood fuel, or innovative ways to capture and use steam power in mountainous terrain. In industrializing Africa, steam technology emerges from the metallurgical innovations that had been developing since the slave trade's disruption was removed. African engineers, working with metals they'd been perfecting for generations, create steam engines optimized for African resources and conditions. The remarkable thing about this parallel development is that each region creates STEAM technology that works best for its own circumstances, rather than trying to copy a single, correct approach. The result is technological diversity that leads to innovation rather than the technological uniformity that colonial dominance created in our timeline. The collaboration that follows proves even more revolutionary than the initial discoveries. When STEAM technology spreads through the new trade networks connecting the Americas, Europe, and Africa, each region's innovations improve the others. European metallurgy enhances American steam engines. American mathematical precision improves European steam calculations. African fuel efficiency techniques benefit everyone. But the most ambitious technological project of this era requires cooperation on a scale never before attempted. The construction of the first intercontinental railroad. This massive undertaking runs not across North America, as in our timeline, but from Aztec territories through Central America to Inca lands, a railway that connects the two great American empires across thousands of miles of challenging terrain. The engineering required for this project exceeds anything attempted in our timeline. Aztec and Inca engineers, drawing on centuries of experience with large-scale construction and transportation, design a railway that crosses every type of terrain from tropical rainforests to high mountain passes. The mathematical calculations alone require cooperation between the best minds of both empires. The construction process becomes a model for international cooperation. Aztec expertise in tropical engineering combines with Inca mastery of mountain construction. Workers from dozens of different American peoples contribute specialized knowledge about local conditions and resources. The result is a transportation network that demonstrates what human cooperation can achieve when it's driven by mutual benefit rather than colonial exploitation. When the railway is completed in 1860, it transforms both American empires. Goods and people can move between Tenochtitlan and Cusco in weeks rather than months. Ideas and innovations spread rapidly across the continent. The railway becomes the backbone for a truly continental economy that rivals anything in the Old World. But perhaps the most important technological development of this era isn't mechanical at all. It's the emergence of new approaches to innovation itself. When different civilizations collaborate as equals rather than one dominating the others, the pace of technological advancement accelerates beyond anything seen in our timeline. American mathematical precision combines with European theoretical knowledge to solve problems that neither could address alone. African metallurgical expertise enhances innovations developed on other continents. The technological exchange that emerges creates a feedback loop where each innovation enables further innovations. The medical advances alone would transform human life. American botanical knowledge, European anatomical understanding, and African surgical techniques combine to create pharmaceutical and medical capabilities that exceed what any single civilization had achieved. Diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia finally meet systematic, scientifically based treatment. Agricultural innovations follow similar patterns. American crop varieties, European livestock, and African farming techniques create agricultural systems more productive and sustainable than any single region had developed. The biological exchanges that had been catastrophic during first contact eventually become beneficial when they're managed through scientific cooperation rather than colonial exploitation. By 1870, the technological landscape of our alternate timeline looks completely alien to anything we know. Innovation proceeds along multiple paths simultaneously. Different civilizations contribute their unique perspectives and capabilities to solve common human challenges. Technology develops to serve human needs rather than to enable domination and exploitation. The stage is set for our final chapter, where we'll step back and see what this remarkable alternate history teaches us about human potential and the contingent nature of the world we actually inhabit. Now, we need to step back from our remarkable journey through an alternate history and ask ourselves, what does this timeline that never was teach us about the world we actually inhabit? The lessons that emerge are both humbling and inspiring, because they reveal fundamental truths about human civilization that our actual history has obscured. Stand back and see what this alternate history teaches us about every civilization we've been taught to call primitive. The Aztecs weren't just warriors obsessed with human sacrifice. They were engineers on the verge of breakthrough innovations that could have transformed the world. Their mathematical and astronomical knowledge already exceeded European achievements in many areas. Given time and freedom from external conquest, they developed technologies that made them equals to any civilization on Earth. The Inca weren't just efficient administrators managing a mountain empire. They were scientists, developing revolutionary techniques that combined sophisticated engineering with sustainable resource management. Their road networks, their agricultural innovations, their understanding of materials and construction, BIN, all of this was building toward achievements that would have amazed any European visitor. African kingdoms weren't just victims waiting to be exploited by slave traders. They were innovative centers, ready to industrialize using techniques adapted to their own resources and conditions. The metallurgical knowledge, the agricultural innovations, the political systems that were developing in Africa before colonial disruption, all of this represented human potential that was interrupted rather than inherently limited. Here's what's actually happening when we examine our alternate timeline. Every civilization that European colonialism labeled as backward or primitive was actually a sophisticated society on its own trajectory of development. The supposed superiority of European civilization wasn't based on inherent advantages. It was based on a series of historical accidents, geographical advantages, and crucial timing that allowed European powers to interrupt other civilizations before they could reach their full potential. This revelation fundamentally challenges the narrative we've been taught about human progress. We've been told that history represents the inevitable advance of civilization from primitive beginnings toward European-style modernity. But our alternate timeline reveals that human progress isn't a ladder with Europeans naturally at the top. It's a web where any strand might have become dominant given different circumstances. The supposed inevitability of European dominance crumbles when we examine how easily it could have been prevented. One storm, one epidemic, one political decision, and the entire trajectory of human civilization changes direction. The world where you're listening to this podcast, where English dominates global communication, where New York and London are financial centers, where democracy spread from American and European examples, none of it was destined to happen. It all hinged on 3 wooden ships, leaving a Spanish harbor on an August morning in 1492. Remove that single event, and we get a world where Tenochtitlan rivals Paris in sophistication, where Cusco anchors a continental transportation network that makes Roman roads look primitive, where Cahokia demonstrates urban planning centuries ahead of European cities, where African kingdoms experience their own industrial revolutions, using technologies adapted to their own resources and needs. But the most profound lesson from our alternate timeline isn't about what different civilizations might have achieved. It's about how human creativity and innovation work when they're freed from the constraints of exploitation and domination. In our alternate world, when civilizations meet as equals rather than as conquerors and conquered, the pace of innovation accelerates beyond anything that happened in our timeline. American mathematical precision combines with European theoretical knowledge to solve problems that neither could address alone. African metallurgical expertise enhances innovations developed on other continents. Asian philosophical and scientific traditions continue evolving along their own trajectories while benefiting from global exchange. The result is technological and cultural development that serves human needs rather than enabling further conquest and exploitation. This is perhaps the most important insight our alternate timeline offers. Human potential flourishes when it's nurtured through cooperation, rather than stifled through domination. The remarkable achievements we've seen in our alternate world aren't fantasies. They're logical extensions of capabilities that actually existed in historical civilizations before colonial disruption interrupted their development. Consider what this means for how we understand our own world. The global inequalities we see today, the technological gaps between different regions, the economic disparities that seem to reflect inherent differences in capability, all of this looks very different when we realize it's the result of historical contingency rather than natural superiority. The wealth of European societies in our timeline wasn't created by superior culture or inherent innovation. It was largely extracted from other regions through colonial exploitation. The technological advantages that enabled European dominance weren't the result of European genius, DMA. They were often developments that happened to occur at the right time and place to enable expansion before other civilizations could catch up. Our alternate timeline shows us that the patterns we take for granted in our world, the dominance of European-derived cultures, the concentration of wealth and technology in certain regions, the political and economic structures that govern global relationships, ACD, all of this represents one possible path among many, not the inevitable result of human development. Understanding this doesn't diminish the importance of our actual history. Pressure, it magnifies it. Every moment in our timeline becomes precious precisely because it wasn't guaranteed. Every decision echoes across centuries in ways we can barely comprehend. The civilization we've built, with all its achievements and problems, represents one remarkable path through infinite possibilities. But perhaps the most important lesson involves what our alternate timeline teaches us about human nature itself. We've been conditioned to think that competition, domination, and exploitation are natural human behaviors that inevitably shape historical development. But our alternate world demonstrates that cooperation, mutual respect, and shared innovation can produce results that exceed anything achieved through conquest and exploitation. The collaborative technologies we've seen developing in our alternate timeline, IST, the joint Aztec-Inca railway projects, the medical advances that combined knowledge from multiple continents, the agricultural innovations that spread benefits globally rather than concentrating wealth in colonial centers, are. All of this shows what becomes possible when human societies work together rather than against each other. This insight has profound implications for how we think about contemporary global challenges. The problems we face today, FAT, climate change, economic inequality, technological disruption, political polarization, MCO, all of these might be more solvable than we realize if we could learn to cooperate as equals rather than competing for dominance. Our alternate timeline suggests that human societies are capable of much more sophisticated cooperation than our actual history demonstrates. The Iroquois Confederacy's democratic institutions, the Aztec Empire's urban planning, the Inca Empire's sustainable resource management, the African kingdom's metallurgical innovations, OPES, all of these represent approaches to human organization that might offer solutions to problems that European-derived political and economic systems have struggled to address. The environmental implications alone are staggering. In our alternate timeline, civilizations that developed without the pressure to exploit resources for colonial export created sustainable relationships with their environments that lasted for centuries. Aboriginal Australian fire management, Inca agricultural terracing, Aztec floating gardens, these weren't primitive techniques, they were sophisticated approaches to resource management that maintained productive ecosystems over very long periods. Contemporary environmental science is just beginning to appreciate how advanced these traditional techniques actually were. Our alternate timeline suggests that if these systems had been allowed to continue developing rather than being disrupted by colonial exploitation, they might have evolved into approaches to environmental management far superior to the industrial techniques that have created our current ecological crisis. The social and political lessons are equally profound. The democratic institutions that emerged in our alternate timeline, IoT, the expanded Iroquois Confederacy, the collaborative networks that enabled intercontinental projects, the trading relationships based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation, all of these demonstrate that human societies can organize themselves in ways that serve collective well-being rather than concentrating power and wealth in the hands of elites. These aren't utopian fantasies. They're logical extensions of political and social innovations that actually existed in historical societies before colonial disruption interrupted their development. Our alternate timeline simply shows what might have happened if these innovations had been allowed to continue evolving rather than being replaced by European-style hierarchical systems. But perhaps the most important insight involves how we think about the future. If our understanding of the past reveals that the current global order isn't inevitable or natural, then our thinking about future possibilities should be equally expanded. The problems that seem intractable today might be solvable using approaches that we haven't considered because our historical experience has been limited to one particular path of development. Our alternate timeline demonstrates that human creativity and innovation are far more flexible and powerful than our actual history suggests. When different approaches to civilization are allowed to develop and interact as equals, the results exceed what any single approach could achieve alone. This insight might be crucial for addressing contemporary challenges that require global cooperation and innovative thinking. The technological implications are equally important. Our alternate timeline shows innovation proceeding along multiple paths simultaneously, with different civilizations contributing unique perspectives and capabilities to solve common human challenges. This model of distributed innovation, where different regions develop technologies suited to their own conditions while sharing knowledge globally, might be more effective than the centralized technological development that has characterized our actual timeline. Understanding this doesn't require us to reject the achievements of our own civilization or to romanticize alternatives that never fully developed. But it does require us to recognize that the particular arrangements of power, wealth, and knowledge that characterize our world represent choices rather than inevitabilities. And if they represent choices, then different choices remain possible. The timeline we're living in, the one where you're listening to this podcast, where certain languages dominate global communication, where particular political and economic systems have spread worldwide, where specific approaches to technology and resource management have become standard, all of this is precious precisely because it wasn't guaranteed. But it's also contingent. Just as 3 ships that never sailed could have created a completely different world, the decisions we make today will shape the world that future generations inherit. The alternate timeline we've explored together demonstrates that human potential is far greater than our actual history suggests, and that cooperation might be more powerful than competition in realizing that potential. Every moment contains infinite possibilities. Every decision echoes across centuries. The world we're creating right now isn't inevitable. It's the result of choices we're making collectively about how human societies should organize themselves and how human creativity should be directed. Our alternate timeline reminds us that we have more power to shape the future than we often realize, and more responsibility to use that power wisely than our actual history has taught us to recognize. The remarkable civilizations we've imagined together aren't fantasies, they're glimpses of human potential that remains available to us if we have the wisdom and courage to pursue it. The ships that never sailed carry us toward a deeper understanding of who we are and who we might yet become.